A streak of confidence amidst the chaos. The bustling, cacophonous rush of Grand Central Station reverberated through the high-vaulted ceilings, every footstep, every voice, every sound contributing to the electric hum of New York City. It was an afternoon like any other, with commuters swarming like a living entity, hurrying to their next destination. Trolleys clattered over the polished floors, and the scent of hot dogs and pretzels mixed with the faint tang of train oil, filling the air. People brushed past each other, lost in their thoughts or late for their trains. Amid this sea of hurried humanity, Tara Jones stood with a quiet grace, moving as though she was above the rush, yet very much a part of it. She wasn't trying to stand out. She wasn't seeking anyone's gaze, but she was unmistakably different. With every confident step, her tailored black skirt swayed ever so slightly, the soft sheen of the fabric catching the ambient light from the towering chandeliers overhead. Her leather blazer hugged her form, suggesting power and poise in equal measure. Her boots, sleek and polished, clicked rhythmically on the stone floor, adding to the symphony of sounds, but keeping to her own beat. Tara was 35 years old, and in many ways, the embodiment of self-assurance. Her posture was perfect, her movements fluid yet deliberate. There was an air about her, a quiet command that suggested she was no ordinary commuter rushing to make a connection. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd, alert to her surroundings. Her lips barely curved into a smile as she observed the motion of the train schedules on the large electronic boards above. This wasn't a leisurely stroll for Tara. This was a woman who was on a mission. To anyone who glanced at her briefly, Tara appeared like just another traveler. There was nothing ostentatious about her. In fact, her presence was so understated that it was almost unremarkable. Yet, if you looked closely, you'd see something different in her posture, in the way she carried herself, like she had experienced life on a deeper level and learned how to navigate through it with quiet control. People moved around her like water flowing around a rock, not realizing they were brushing against someone far more significant than they could imagine. However, there were others who did notice her, and it was these people, two police officers standing near a pillar, that caught her attention as they broke away from the crowd and started walking toward her. Officer Riley, tall and stocky, had an air of self-importance that almost made his presence noticeable before his uniform did. He was older than his partner, and his every step had the swagger of someone who believed that the badge on his chest was an invitation for others to clear a path. His younger partner, Officer Grant, trailed slightly behind, looking unsure and uncomfortable, his hand nervously adjusting the strap of his duty belt. The two of them were a stark contrast, but they both shared one thing in common, a sense of superiority that came from the power they wielded as officers of the law. Riley's eyes locked onto Tara in the crowd, his mind already making a snap judgment. There was something about her, a presence that felt too controlled, too composed for someone just passing through the station. Without giving much thought to it, he gave the slightest nod to Grant, who obediently followed him as they cut through the sea of travelers, drawing closer to Tara. "Ma'am." Officer Riley's voice was calculated, carrying the weight of authority. His tone was edged with a false politeness that didn't quite mask his underlying sense of superiority. "Could you please stop for a moment?" Tara halted mid-step, her brow lifting slightly, the movement so subtle that it was almost imperceptible. Her calmness in the face of the sudden interruption was telling. Her eyes met Riley's, assessing, gauging the situation in an instant. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was even, unflinching. She wasn't rattled. Riley took a small step forward, his smirk widening as he leaned in a little too close for comfort. His voice dropped a pitch, attempting to infuse his words with a sense of control. "Routine check," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Tara's gaze sharpened as she took in his words. "Description of what exactly?" she asked, her tone shifting, now laced with the smallest hint of suspicion. She didn't play along with his insinuations, not for a second. Riley's grin widened further, clearly enjoying the power he believed he held. "We'll figure that out," he said, stepping closer, his voice lowering even more. "Step aside, please." Tara, still unfazed, folded her arms across her chest, her stance firm and unwavering. It was as though the space around her was suddenly filled with an invisible force field, one that made the mundane action of simply standing feel like an assertion of strength. "I'm on official business," she replied calmly, her words laced with quiet authority. "Is that a crime?" Grant, shifting uncomfortably behind Riley, seemed to sense the tension mounting in the exchange. His eyes darted between the two of them, as if searching for some sort of guidance on how to handle the situation. "Maybe we should call this in," Grant suggested nervously, his voice almost apologetic. Riley, however, wasn't about to back down. He waved off his partner with an exaggerated motion, his eyes narrowing at Tara. He believed his badge and his tone were enough to intimidate anyone, and he wasn't about to let one woman in a skirt undermine his authority. With a quick motion, he reached into Tara's bag without asking for permission, his fingers brushing against hers in a way that felt more like an invasion than a procedural action. Tara's eyes didn't leave him as he opened the bag and rifled through its contents. Then, without warning, his hand froze. The brash cockiness in his posture faltered as he fumbled with the items inside. Among the personal items, a wallet, a few receipts, and a half-empty bottle of water, was something that clearly didn't belong in the ordinary purse of a commuter, a sleek, official CIA badge. And next to it, nestled into the lining of the bag, was a loaded Glock, its matte black finish gleaming ominously under the station's bright fluorescent lights. Riley's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Tara, in contrast, remained calm and composed as she retrieved the badge and the gun from his trembling hands, her movements deliberate and slow. Her eyes locked onto Riley's, piercing him with a gaze that felt colder than the concrete floors beneath them. "Now," she said, her voice chilling in its calmness, "would you like to explain why you just harassed a federal agent?" The words hit him like a ton of bricks, shattering the carefully constructed wall of authority he had built. His face flushed a deep red, his earlier bravado crumbling as panic began to take root. Tara had completely flipped the script, and now Riley was the one left to explain himself. But no explanation could cover the mistake he had made. The veil lifts. The shock hung in the air like a dense fog. Grand Central Station, a place that normally thrived with the buzz of daily life, now felt as though it had come to a halt. The crowd around Tara and the officers seemed to take a collective breath, their attention drawn in by the tense standoff between the confident federal agent and the now flustered police officers. The rhythmic click of Tara's heels on the polished floor had been replaced by the heavy, anticipatory silence that settled over the scene like a blanket. Riley stood frozen for a moment, his hand still grasping the edge of Tara's bag, his fingers reluctant to let go of the item that had just sent his world spiraling into chaos. He looked down at the badge in his hand, and then at the Glock, both of which seemed to mock him with their simple, undeniable clarity. The weight of the CIA badge was as heavy as any physical object he'd ever held, but it wasn't the metal that made him tremble. It was the realization that he had just made the gravest error of his career. "A federal agent," he stammered, his voice cracking as he fumbled with his words. His mind raced, scrambling for any semblance of control or explanation. The polished exterior of confidence he had worn only moments before was gone, replaced with a deep, visceral unease. Tara didn't move, didn't flinch. Her stance remained firm, but her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, bore into him with a piercing intensity. She didn't need to say another word. Her silence was enough to send a shiver down Riley's spine. Her very presence radiated authority, and now that he had crossed her, he was beginning to understand just how dangerously out of his depth he truly was. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Tara asked, her voice colder than the steel beams that supported the roof above them. There was no anger in her words, only an ice-cold professionalism that seemed to cut through the tension with surgical precision. She was the embodiment of controlled power, and Riley, for the first time in his life, felt small in the face of it. Grant, who had been standing off to the side, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, took a half step forward. His eyes flickered nervously between Tara and Riley, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the weight of his partner's misstep. His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "It was a mistake," he muttered, attempting to calm the situation, his hand twitching towards his radio, as if seeking some sort of escape from the mess that was unfolding. "We didn't mean any harm." But Tara's gaze didn't waver from Riley. Her eyes locked onto him, as if willing him to understand the gravity of his actions. "No," she replied firmly, her voice unyielding. "It wasn't a mistake. It was an abuse of power." Her words sliced through the noise of the station, cutting past the murmurs of the crowd that had gathered around them. "You thought I was a threat simply because of the way I look, because I'm a woman, because I'm black. And that," she said with a measured pause, "is unacceptable." The crowd around them had slowly come to a stop. People who had been rushing to their destinations, faces set with the usual determination of city life, were now watching intently, their eyes flicking between Tara, Riley, and Grant. Some had phones out, silently recording the confrontation, while others stood frozen, unsure of how to react to the unraveling drama. The air had shifted. What had once been the mundane hum of the city's daily hustle was now filled with the palpable tension of a moment about to explode. Tara's words hung in the air, settling over the officers like a heavy fog. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The sharpness of her conviction, the unshakable calm in her voice, did all the work for her. Riley and Grant were the ones who were unraveling, their own assumptions and misjudgments exposing the fragility of their perceived authority. "How many times," Tara continued, her voice growing in intensity, "have you done this to someone else? How many times have you used your badge as an excuse to intimidate and bully? How many times have you assumed that you could trample over people because of the color of their skin or the way they walk? You thought I was just another target, didn't you? Just another person you could take advantage of because you thought I wouldn't fight back." Riley's face flushed crimson, but not from anger. His cheeks burned with shame. The quiet confidence that had once been his shield had been stripped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. There was nothing he could say to justify what he had done, nothing that could erase the weight of his actions. Tara's voice, now steady and unwavering, pierced through the awkward silence. "You don't get to decide who's a threat based on your prejudices. You don't get to wield your power like that. Not when you don't know who you're dealing with." She looked directly at Riley, her eyes unwavering. "And as for you," she said, turning her gaze to Grant, who had been standing with his hands awkwardly at his sides, "you have the power to stop this, but you chose not to. You chose to follow your partner's lead without questioning it. That makes you complicit." Grant took a half step back, clearly rattled by her words. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no sound came out. His gaze dropped to the floor, his discomfort palpable. For the first time in his career, he was beginning to realize that his role in law enforcement wasn't about following orders blindly. It was about upholding justice. And this moment, this encounter with Tara, was anything but just. The crowd had grown in size, but their focus remained fixed on the unfolding exchange. People shifted their weight from one foot to the other, craning their necks to see what would happen next. Some of them whispered to one another, exchanging knowing glances. Others remained silent, too absorbed in the confrontation to even blink. Tara's words, calm and precise, were beginning to ripple through the bystanders, shifting their perceptions. This wasn't just a woman standing up to two officers. This was something bigger, a challenge to authority, a challenge to the very system that had allowed this kind of behavior to fester for far too long. Riley shifted on his feet, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to regain some semblance of control. We "We didn't know who you were," he muttered weakly, his voice devoid of the confidence it had carried just moments before. "We thought you might be a threat." Tara didn't even flinch at his words. She had heard it all before. The excuses, the justifications, the feeble attempts to cover up the underlying biases that had guided Riley's actions. It was a game as old as time. The abuse of power disguised as a routine check, the racial profiling wrapped in the illusion of justice. Tara wasn't buying it. Not for a second. "Let me make this crystal clear for you," Tara said, her voice ringing out with finality. "The only threat here is the one you've created. The only danger is the one you've brought to this moment. And if you think for one second that you can get away with this, you're sorely mistaken." Her gaze, cold and unflinching, swept across the gathered crowd, making sure everyone heard her words. "I'm reporting both of you," she declared, her voice firm. "You've crossed a line, and there will be consequences." The words hit Riley and Grant like a physical blow. They stood there, stunned, caught in the web of their own making, unable to find a way out. The atmosphere in the station had changed irreversibly. The tension that had once been confined to the small space around the officers and Tara had now spilled out into the crowd. This wasn't just about one woman standing up for herself. It was about a larger truth that had been exposed, one that could no longer be ignored. As Tara reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, the entire station seemed to collectively hold its breath. She unlocked the screen with a swift, practiced motion, the camera app lighting up the surroundings with its bright glow. "State your names and badge numbers," she ordered, her voice calm but laced with authority. Riley hesitated for a moment, the magnitude of the situation finally dawning on him. He could no longer hide behind his badge, no longer rely on the unearned trust that had always been afforded to him. Grant, sensing the gravity of the moment, quickly stepped in. "Officer Grant," he said, his voice subdued. "Badge number 47,862. Tara didn't move her gaze from Riley. He squirmed for a moment, then muttered, barely audible, "Officer Riley, badge number 48,753. The words left his mouth like a reluctant confession, his voice stripped of the arrogance it had once carried. Tara didn't flinch as she locked the camera's focus on their faces. She wasn't interested in their apologies or their fear. She was focused on one thing: accountability. And in that moment, she made it clear that nothing, not even their badges, would shield them from it. The reckoning. As the camera's lens captured the officers' faces, time seemed to slow down around Tara Jones. The steady rhythm of her breath, the hum of conversations in the background, and the far-off screech of a train pulling into the station faded into a distant blur. In that moment, everything narrowed down to her and the two officers who had just crossed the line. Two men who had underestimated her, two men who had made a dangerous assumption. Tara stood unmoving, her gaze locked firmly on Riley. Her phone's camera light reflected off the smooth surface of her skin, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. The crowd around them, once hurried and indifferent, had now gathered in a loose circle, their eyes wide with curiosity. Phones were raised in the air, some recording, others discreetly snapping pictures of the moment. It was a rare thing to witness an agent of the law bring two officers to heel, but that's exactly what was happening in the heart of Grand Central. Riley's face had gone a strange shade of crimson. His usual swagger was nowhere to be found. The man who had once strutted through the crowd, acting as if his badge made him untouchable, now stood humbled, his confidence shattered in a matter of seconds. He fidgeted, his hand reaching up to tug at the collar of his uniform, the fabric suddenly feeling tight around his neck. Sweat dotted his brow despite the cool temperature of the station. Grant, on the other hand, stood a few steps back, his face pale. His hands were clenched at his sides, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like an invisible force. Unlike Riley, who was consumed by his shame, Grant seemed to be processing the truth of the moment. He had been complicit in this encounter. His actions, or rather, his inactions, had allowed Riley to take control of the situation in the worst possible way. And now, standing there, he realized just how wrong everything had gone. Tara didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was her weapon. The power dynamics had shifted. She had gone from being the victim of suspicion to the one in control. The crowd could feel it too. People, once indifferent to the world around them, were now acutely aware of what was happening. Whispers began to spread among them, the murmur of recognition flowing through the sea of onlookers. "This is ridiculous," Riley muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by desperation. He reached up to adjust his hat, but his movements lacked the sharp confidence they once had. "I didn't know who you were," he repeated, as though saying it again would somehow absolve him. Tara's lips curled into a thin line, her voice now steady and precise. "It doesn't matter who I am," she said, her words slicing through the thick tension like a hot knife through butter. "What matters is how you treated me. You had no reason to approach me. You had no right to stop me. And you certainly had no right to invade my privacy based on nothing more than your assumptions." Riley opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. His mind was racing, his thoughts disjointed, and all of them pointed to one undeniable fact. He had misjudged Tara, and now there was no escaping the consequences. Grant's voice, meek and tentative, broke through the silence. "Look, it was just a misunderstanding. We thought you were someone else. We didn't mean any harm." His words were rushed, almost pleading. He shifted from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. "Please, let's just move on. This doesn't have to go any further." But Tara wasn't having it. She looked at Grant, her eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. "A misunderstanding?" she asked incredulously. "You thought I was someone else. What exactly do you mean by that?" "Someone who looked suspicious because I'm a woman of color, because I'm carrying myself with confidence, because I'm dressed professionally." Grant swallowed hard. His eyes darted around the crowd, then back to Tara, and then to Riley, who still seemed stunned by the turn of events. He didn't know what to say. The truth was right in front of him, but admitting it meant acknowledging something he wasn't ready to face. Tara pressed on. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice rising slightly, the firmness now clear in her tone. "You didn't mean harm. But harm was done, nonetheless. You don't get to violate someone's space because of a hunch or a stereotype. You don't get to use your badge as a weapon of intimidation." The crowd had grown larger, their attention fully captured now. The quiet murmurs from earlier had turned into louder whispers, and a few people had even stopped to watch the confrontation with an intensity that made it clear they were witnessing something far more than just an argument. This was a confrontation with authority, with the system that had for so long allowed these kinds of abuses to go unchecked. Tara turned to address the gathering crowd, her eyes sweeping over them, as if calling them to witness the truth that was unfolding. "This is not just about me," she said, her voice ringing with strength. "This is about all of us. Every person who's ever been judged or harassed because of the way they look, the way they walk, the way they dress. This is about the power imbalance that has existed for far too long." The air in the station felt charged now, electric with the weight of her words. Riley and Grant stood side by side, their earlier certainty completely gone. The quiet confidence that had defined their roles as officers of the law was now shattered, replaced by the stark reality that they had failed in their duty. Tara wasn't finished yet. She had come too far to let this moment slip away. "I will report both of you," she stated plainly, her voice unwavering. "This will not go unaddressed. You will be held accountable for what you've done today. There will be an investigation, and you will be exposed for what you are." The words were a clear declaration, a promise to herself and to the crowd that she would not back down. Tara knew the system was flawed, that it was easy for someone like Riley to get away with behavior like this for years, using his badge as a shield. But today, in this moment, things were different. Riley seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. His shoulders slumped slightly, his eyes flicking nervously toward the growing crowd, as though hoping for some sort of rescue. But there was no escape. Tara's resolve was unshakable. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. Grant, unable to take the mounting pressure any longer, stepped forward. We'll call it in," he said, his voice still shaky. "We'll make sure everything is documented. But please, just—" He faltered, unsure of what to ask for. Tara wasn't interested in any half-hearted gestures of accountability. "No," Tara said firmly, her tone now as sharp as steel. "You don't get to make this about your convenience. This is about taking responsibility. It's about recognizing the harm you've caused and owning up to it." Her phone's camera remained focused on the two officers, documenting the moment for all to see. Tara wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. She wasn't going to let them rewrite the narrative in their favor, as they so often had the power to do. Today, she was rewriting the story. With a final glance at the crowd, Tara spoke one last time. "You have two options now. You can choose to own up to your mistake, or you can continue pretending like this never happened. But know this, if you choose the latter, you won't get away with it." The station, once filled with the noise of daily transit, now hummed with the quiet reverberation of change. The eyes of the crowd were upon Riley and Grant, their every movement scrutinized, their every word held accountable. Tara's calm strength had done what hours of shouting and protesting never could. It had exposed the truth. As Tara slipped her phone back into her bag and turned on her heel, she knew that this was just the beginning. This wasn't a victory yet. It was a reckoning. And the battle for justice had only just begun. The aftershock. The tension that had filled Grand Central Station slowly began to dissipate, but it left a thick, heavy residue in the air. As Tara walked away from the two stunned officers, the energy around her shifted. She moved with the same quiet confidence, but now the air felt charged with something more, something that couldn't be ignored. The once bustling station seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of the confrontation. The commuters who had gathered, some with their phones still raised, were now left standing in an uneasy silence, unsure of what had just transpired, yet acutely aware of its significance. The officers, once so sure of themselves, were left standing in the center of it all, surrounded by the crowd that had witnessed their humiliation. Grant's face remained pale, his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet the eyes of anyone around him. He had never imagined his career would lead him to this point. His hands, which moments ago had been steady, now trembled, and his breath came in shallow gasps, as though he couldn't quite escape the suffocating weight of what had just unfolded. Riley, on the other hand, stood rooted in place, his hands clenched at his sides, his face red with a mixture of anger and shame. His pride had been broken, and his mind raced, looking for ways to repair the damage. But no matter how much he tried to regain his composure, the echo of Tara's words rang through his head. "You thought I was a threat because of the way I look, because I'm a woman, because I'm black." The realization hit him like a gut punch, a truth so simple and so painful that it was almost impossible to digest. For a moment, neither of the officers moved. They stood there in a strange, silent paralysis, as if unsure of what to do next. The crowd around them had begun to disperse, but the weight of the moment lingered. People whispered to one another, some shaking their heads, some exchanging knowing glances. Tara's words had struck a nerve. And now, even though the scene was over, the aftershock was felt by everyone who had witnessed it. Tara didn't turn back. She had said what needed to be said, and now it was time to walk away. But her mind was still buzzing, her thoughts running in every direction as she made her way to her destination. She didn't need the validation of a crowd or the satisfaction of seeing the officers squirm. She knew that what had happened was about something bigger. It was about the power that could be reclaimed when one person stood their ground, when they chose to challenge the system, even in the smallest of ways. She had done what was necessary, but the truth was, this moment was not an isolated one. Tara knew that her experience was not unique. Far from it. Every day, countless others found themselves in situations just like this, where they were judged based on assumptions and stereotypes, where their dignity was undermined, not because of who they were, but because of what others thought they were. What had happened at Grand Central wasn't just about her standing up to two police officers. It was about shining a light on the institutional biases that so often went unchecked. Her phone buzzed in her bag, interrupting her thoughts. Tara pulled it out and unlocked the screen, finding a string of messages and missed calls. The first message was from her superior at the CIA, asking if she was all right. The second was from an old friend, sending her a simple, yet pointed, message. What happened at Grand Central? It's all over the news. Tara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized the scene had attracted that much attention. Her thoughts immediately turned back to the crowd, the witnesses who had recorded the interaction, the way their phones had captured the entire confrontation. She had expected her actions to be witnessed by a few, but the ripple effect was far larger than she anticipated. News outlets, social media, and bystanders had now made her stand against the officers public. It was inevitable. Of course, in this day and age, a moment like that couldn't remain private. The video was bound to go viral. She scrolled through the messages quickly, her eyes narrowing at the footage now circulating online. There were clips of the officers' faces, clearly uncomfortable as they stood under Tara's gaze. There were shots of her speaking calmly but forcefully, holding her phone in front of them, demanding accountability. The video, however, didn't show everything. It didn't show the quiet strength that Tara had exuded, nor did it capture the weight of her words. But it didn't matter. The message had been made loud and clear, and people were listening. Tara's phone buzzed again, this time with an alert from the local news station. Breaking news. Grand Central confrontation. Woman identifies as CIA agent after officer's harassment. Video goes viral. Her stomach twisted slightly at the headline, but she wasn't surprised. This kind of exposure was part of the game. She had expected it. What mattered was the narrative that followed. Would people understand what had really happened, or would they just see it as another viral video? Would they recognize the deeper issues at play, or would they focus on the drama of the moment? She walked briskly toward the exit of the station, her mind whirling. The idea of being thrust into the public spotlight was never something she had wanted, but now that it had happened, she knew she couldn't back down. She couldn't let this moment slip into the realm of sensationalism. It wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger than that. As she stepped out into the crisp evening air, she took a deep breath, forcing her mind to focus. The city was alive around her, the lights of Times Square flickering in the distance. People were everywhere, but Tara felt detached from the world around her. The confrontation had drained something from her, and she needed a moment to regain her composure. She needed to think about what to do next. Just as she began to walk toward a nearby cafe to gather her thoughts, her phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. Without hesitation, Tara answered. "This is Tara Jones," she said, her voice composed. "Agent Jones," came the voice on the other end, sharp and authoritative. "This is Director Wills from the CIA. I've seen the footage. I need you to come in. We need to discuss what happened at Grand Central." Tara felt a knot form in her stomach. The director's tone was as professional as ever, but there was an edge to his voice that made it clear this wasn't just a routine check-in. "Understood, sir," she replied evenly. "I'll be there shortly." The conversation was brief, and Tara ended the call with a sigh. There was no time to waste. The CIA would want a full report on what had happened, but Tara knew this conversation would go deeper than just the incident itself. She had been harassed by officers, yes, but the bigger issue, one that could no longer be ignored, was the systemic racism and abuse of power that so many people faced every single day. She had taken a stand, but now, the real work was just beginning. This wasn't about a single viral moment. It was about holding the system accountable, about using her position to challenge the status quo. As she made her way to the CIA office, Tara couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn. Grand Central Station had become the crucible for something much larger than an isolated confrontation. It had become the starting point for something that could change the course of her life, and perhaps the lives of others who had been silently enduring these injustices for far too long. The reckoning was far from over. The burden of truth. Tara arrived at the CIA headquarters just as the last traces of daylight were fading, the skyline of Washington, D.C., bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. She walked through the sleek glass doors of the building, her stride deliberate, unwavering. Inside, the sterile, modern design of the office mirrored the precise, calculating nature of the agency itself. Agents moved through the corridors with an air of purpose, but there was a subtle tension in the air today, as if everyone could feel the ripple of the events at Grand Central, spreading beyond just the incident itself. The elevator ride up to the director's office felt longer than usual. Tara stood in silence, watching the floor numbers light up, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what to expect when she entered the director's office. She knew the conversation would be serious, but she had no idea how the agency would react to what had happened. Would they see her actions as a threat to the CIA's reputation, or would they recognize the need for a reckoning, even within their own ranks? She had no answers, only the certainty that she had done what was right. And now, she would have to face whatever came next. The elevator dinged as it reached the top floor, and the doors opened to reveal the sleek, minimalist decor of Director Will's office. Tara stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor as she made her way down the hall. She was greeted by an assistant who wordlessly gestured for her to enter the director's office. Inside, Director Wills was sitting at his desk, his eyes focused on a series of documents in front of him. He didn't look up as Tara entered, but the stillness in his posture suggested he had already anticipated her arrival. The moment the door closed behind her, he looked up, meeting her gaze with a mixture of curiosity and authority. "Agent Jones," Wills said, his voice neutral but laced with an undertone of something deeper, concern, perhaps, or something more difficult to place. "Sit." Tara took the chair opposite his desk, her posture still as rigid as ever, but her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had spent the entire drive to the headquarters rehearsing what she would say, but now that she was here, the words didn't come as easily as she had expected. She waited for the director to speak again. "I've seen the footage from Grand Central," Wills began, his tone businesslike, but not without a hint of recognition. "I've also been briefed on the situation. I don't need to remind you of the delicate nature of your position within this agency, do I?" Tara's eyes never left Wills as she shook her head. "No, sir." The director leaned forward, his fingers steepled together in front of him. "Then you're aware that this incident has placed both you and the agency under a great deal of scrutiny." His gaze softened ever so slightly, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his words. What happened at Grand Central, while an unfortunate misunderstanding, has already begun to make waves in the media. It's not just a viral video. It's a narrative that's being shaped by every person who saw it. And you, Agent Jones, have become the face of that narrative. Tara nodded slowly. She had anticipated this. The media storm, the questions, the way everything would be magnified. But she hadn't anticipated the weight of it. She had hoped to keep the focus on the broader issue, the systemic racism and abuse of power that had led to the encounter. But she knew that wasn't always how these things played out. She had done her part, but now she was being swept into a much larger conversation, one that was bigger than just her own actions. "I'm aware, Director," she said calmly. "But I also know what I did was necessary. It wasn't about drawing attention to myself. It was about standing up to an abuse of power that had been allowed to go unchecked for too long. If I hadn't taken a stand, who would have? How many others have suffered in silence, believing that they have no recourse, no way to fight back?" Wills didn't immediately respond. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his eyes studying her carefully, almost as if he were weighing her every word. "You've made a powerful statement," he said at last. "But that statement is not without consequences. The agency cannot afford to appear divided on issues of law enforcement, especially when our own agents are involved in such high-profile incidents. This has complicated things." Tara's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. She had anticipated some pushback, but the way Will spoke made it clear that this wasn't just about public relations. There was more at stake: her career, her credibility, and perhaps even her future within the agency. "Are you suggesting that I should have stayed silent, sir?" Tara asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. Will's eyes hardened. "I'm suggesting that you should have considered the consequences before you took such drastic action. You were right to assert your position as a federal agent, but the way you handled the situation, escalating it, making it public, engaging in a standoff in front of a crowd, raises questions about your judgment." Tara's chest tightened, but she refused to back down. "With all due respect, sir, I did what was necessary. This isn't just about a single incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that has been allowed to persist, unchecked. The officers who stopped me, what they did was wrong. It wasn't just about me. It's about every person who has been unfairly profiled, harassed, or discriminated against because of who they are. I couldn't just walk away from that. Not anymore." There was a long silence as Wills processed her words. Tara could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, the struggle between his professional responsibility and his understanding of the larger issue. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed. "You've made your point, Agent Jones," Will said, his tone softer now. "And I'm not unsympathetic to your cause. But you must understand, the agency must navigate this carefully. There are already forces at play, internal and external, that will want to use this moment to question our role, our influence, and our methods. The scrutiny will only intensify." Tara didn't flinch at his words. "I understand, Director. But I also know that this is a chance to address something larger than just an individual mistake. If we're truly committed to justice, to making a real difference, then we can't allow these issues to be swept under the rug. We have to face them head-on." The director studied her for a long moment, as though assessing her resolve. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxing ever so slightly. "I admire your conviction," Will said slowly, "and I believe you have the potential to do great things within this agency. But you must also understand that change doesn't come without cost. You've made a bold move, Agent Jones, but now you'll have to live with the fallout." Tara nodded. She was no stranger to sacrifice. The path she had chosen wasn't one that promised easy answers or smooth victories, but she was willing to walk it, no matter the consequences. "I'm prepared for that, sir," she said firmly. "I knew the risks when I made that decision. But it was the right one." Wills exhaled deeply, as though releasing the weight of the conversation. "Then I'll make sure that this doesn't undermine everything you've worked for. But understand this, what happens next is crucial. You'll need to prove that your actions were a catalyst for change, not a spectacle for the media. I'll make sure you have the support you need, but it's up to you to lead the way." Tara nodded again, more determined now than ever. She was ready to face whatever came next, ready to turn this moment into something bigger, something lasting. "I'll lead, sir," she said, "and I'll make sure the truth is heard, every step of the way." The director's expression softened for the first time. "I know you will, Agent Jones. Now go. We'll continue to monitor the situation. But remember, the road ahead will be challenging." Tara rose from her seat, her mind still swirling with the enormity of what was to come. As she turned to leave the office, she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And she was ready to fight for the change that was so desperately needed. The burden of truth weighed heavy, but Tara felt the power it gave her to stand tall, to challenge the system, and to demand the justice that was long overdue. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, She felt truly certain of her path. The turning point. In the days following the confrontation at Grand Central Station, the story of Tara Jones spread like wildfire. The footage, now circulating on every social media platform and news outlet, had painted a vivid picture. What had begun as a routine check had turned into an explosive moment of accountability, capturing the attention of the nation. Tara had expected the attention. She had expected the scrutiny. But even she was unprepared for how fast the media narrative would shift, how quickly the spotlight would turn to her. From the moment she had left Director Will's office, Tara knew that her battle was only just beginning. The CIA had pledged to support her, but the question was, how far would that support go? Would they protect her if the tide of public opinion turned against her, or would they distance themselves from the agent who had gone rogue, as some might see it, and risked exposing the cracks in the system? She sat in her apartment, surrounded by the silence of her own thoughts, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages. She had become the subject of countless debates. Some applauded her actions, praising her courage for standing up against law enforcement, while others criticized her, claiming that she had gone too far, that she had jeopardized the authority of the agency and law enforcement itself. The public had already drawn its battle lines. On one side, there were the defenders of Tara's actions, who saw her as a voice for justice and accountability. They hailed her as a hero, someone who had the courage to stand up to systemic abuses and challenge authority, even when it meant putting herself at risk. On the other side, there were those who felt that her actions had been an overstep, a dangerous challenge to law enforcement, and the agencies meant to protect citizens. They accused her of disrupting the order, of playing into the hands of those who wanted to paint law enforcement with a broad brush of corruption and abuse. The calls continued to pour in, media outlets wanting to interview her, news anchors wanting her to appear on live television, politicians wanting to align themselves with her cause or distance themselves from it. Tara ignored most of the calls, preferring to stay off the radar for a while. She wasn't interested in becoming a media sensation. What had happened at Grand Central had been about something far more important than her personal reputation. But no matter how much she tried to distance herself, she couldn't escape the growing public pressure. A message popped up on her phone, this one from an unknown number. "We need to talk. It's about the fallout. Can you meet?" Tara's fingers hovered over the screen as she considered the message. It wasn't from anyone she recognized, but there was an urgency in the request that piqued her interest. After a moment's hesitation, she typed out a reply. "Where?" The response was swift. "The old cafe on 6th. We'll be waiting." Tara stared at the message, a knot forming in her stomach. She had no idea who was behind this message, but there was a strange sense of familiarity in the way the words had been phrased. It could have been anyone. Someone from the agency, a reporter, or perhaps someone with a different agenda altogether. But curiosity got the best of her, and after a few moments of silent reflection, she decided to go. Whatever this was, it was bound to be a conversation she needed to have. She slipped on a black jacket, not bothering with any kind of disguise, knowing full well that her presence in public would still be noticeable. The media coverage had made her a known face, but she wasn't concerned with being recognized. She was concerned with finding answers, with understanding how her actions had ignited such a firestorm. The world had changed in the days since her encounter with the officers, and she needed to know who else was watching, who else was involved in this growing narrative. The cafe was located in a quieter part of the city, away from the chaos of the more commercial streets. It was a small, tucked-away place, with a faded neon sign that flickered intermittently in the evening light. As Tara approached, she noticed a lone figure sitting at a corner table, his back to her. She felt a pang of unease. Was this a trap? Was this person part of some larger operation trying to manipulate the situation? But when the figure turned to face her, the tension eased slightly. The man was in his late 40s, wearing a plain jacket and glasses. His face was familiar in a way that made Tara pause. It wasn't until he spoke that recognition clicked into place. "Agent Jones," he said with a nod. "I'm Samir Rahim. I used to work with your department on covert operations. Tara's eyes narrowed as she approached, her mind running through a dozen possibilities. Samir Rahim. She hadn't heard that name in years. He was a former CIA agent who had worked in various intelligence operations before being quietly dismissed. His departure had been a mystery. No one had talked about it. Some said it was a matter of personal choice. Others hinted at something more troubling. But the details had never been fully explained. I thought you were out of the game, Tara said cautiously, sitting down across from him. Samir gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. I was. But sometimes the game has a way of pulling you back in, especially when things start to get complicated. Tara studied him closely. Complicated? What are you talking about? Samir leaned forward, lowering his voice as if ensuring no one else could overhear. You've made a lot of noise, Tara. And that noise isn't just going unnoticed by the public. It's caught the attention of some very powerful people within the agency. People who are less than pleased with the way things have unfolded. Tara's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean by that? Samir's expression grew more serious. There's been a growing divide within the agency since you went public. Some people see you as a hero, someone who's shaking up the system for the better. Others see you as a liability, someone who's threatening to expose the cracks in the foundation. And those people, they'll stop at nothing to protect the status quo. Tara leaned back in her chair, digesting his words. She knew she had made waves, but hearing it from someone like Samir, someone who had seen the inner workings of the agency, made the reality of the situation feel even more dire. So, what are you saying? She asked, her voice steady but her mind reeling. Are you telling me that the agency might come after me? Samir hesitated, then nodded slowly. I don't know what the higher-ups are planning, but I do know this. You've become a target, and not just from outside forces. There are people within the agency who would rather see you silenced. The weight of his words hung heavy between them. Tara felt a chill creep down her spine, but she quickly shoved the feeling aside. She couldn't afford to be intimidated. Not now, not after everything she had already fought for. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice quieter now, but still resolute. What do you want from me? Samir took a deep breath, his eyes studying her with a certain mixture of sympathy and caution. I'm telling you because I believe in what you're trying to do. But you need to be careful. The people who are coming after you, they're not just after your reputation. They want to destroy everything you stand for. They'll use anything, anyone, to take you down. And right now you've got two choices. Fight back or get out of the way. Tara's eyes narrowed. And you think I'll just walk away? He shook his head, his lips curling into a wry smile. I don't think you will. But the truth is, this isn't just about you anymore. You've become part of something much bigger than yourself. And you need to decide where you stand, because once you make that choice, there's no turning back. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, and Tara felt the full weight of what she was up against. She had taken a stand, but now, the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a battle for the truth itself, and the cost of that truth might be more than she was prepared to pay. As she stood to leave, Samir's voice followed her, one last warning. Choose wisely, Tara. You can't fight this battle half-heartedly. Not if you want to survive. The door closed behind her with a quiet click, and Tara stepped out into the night, her mind a storm of uncertainty. She had always believed in the importance of fighting for what was right. But now, the lines between right and wrong had blurred. And the path ahead, though still unclear, was one she knew she would have to walk alone.